next experiential learning principle is that it's important that students get off to a good start. We have to plan a very comprehensive orientation program for when the students arrive at the hospital. This should include a tour of facilities so they understand where things are in the hospital, introductions of key people, other personnel in the pharmacy department that students will be in contact with, key members of the medical staff or nursing staff, any other individuals in the hospital who the students may have contact with. They should be introduced to. There should be an interview process to identify the personal interests and background of the students. Time should be set aside during the very first day of the rotation for the preceptor to sit down with the students and get to know them a little bit. Find out what their interests are, find out what their expectations are for the rotation, find out what it is about pharmacy that they like, anything at all that might help the preceptor to relate to the student and, where possible, to tailor the learning experience of the student. It's important also to emphasize the key points of the manual and any major expectations of students so they know exactly what to expect. One of the things that's so important about a good orientation program is that it sends a clear message to the students that the preceptor values them being there and the preceptor is serious about his or her teaching responsibilities. They should also arrange for review discussions or background reading. This is a good time to schedule in any discussions that the preceptor is going to have to ensure that students have the right foundational knowledge they will need for the rotation, or to assign specific reading that might help students to strengthen their foundational knowledge in key areas that relate to the types of patients that the students might be encountering or the type of disease states. Anything that the students need to brush up on can be included during this orientation program. And lastly, they need to explain any very important institutional or pharmacy policies so the students don't inadvertently violate some major policy of the hospital or the pharmacy department. We can't hold them accountable for adhering to policies that they're not aware of, and they're not employees of the hospital, so there is no way they would be aware of any such policies unless we educate them about them as they first arrive at the rotation. Let me pose a question to you based on what we've discussed thus far in this session. How does a preceptor benefit to have students fill out documentation forms? Think about that for a second. Now, obviously, the student benefits from filling out documentation forms because it guides the student's learning. The form systematically requires a student to obtain information and record that information, and perhaps even to analyze and make value judgments about that information. But having students fill out documentation forms is also a very great benefit to the preceptor because it makes it much easier for the preceptor to keep tabs on what the student is doing. I found this to be especially true when I would be precepting 4, 5, or 6 students at a time. It would be very time-consuming to individually spend time having each student present all their patients to me verbally. It was much easier for me to be able to review their monitoring forms and then ask specific questions of each student. It was time better spent. Also consider what message a detailed organization and planning system sends to students when they first start the rotation. If a preceptor puts a lot of time into preparing a manual with a lot of important, meaningful information in it for the students, information that over the course of the rotation the student can appreciate as being very beneficial and strengthening student learning, the student gets an appreciation for the commitment that the preceptor has to their education. And this is a very important element of helping the preceptor develop a good relationship with the student. If a student understands that a preceptor takes teaching very seriously, that student will appreciate what the preceptor does and will be more likely to comply with the requests of the preceptor. So it strengthens the entire learning experience for the student, and it makes it a much smoother experience for the preceptor. So let's review what we've covered in session 3, building structure into a rotation. The experiential learning principles are first, that experiential training should be well planned and organized, just like basketball practice. Think about John Wooden, the great basketball coach, who meticulously planned his basketball practices minute to minute. Think of the success that he had with that approach. Structure provides efficiency and consistency. Structure provides consistency from rotation to rotation, student to student. The experience is going to be pretty much the same because so much structure has been built into it, and it's so well organized. It's also going to be much more efficient. There's going to be much less downtime because of the detailed planning and organization that was put into the rotation. It's going to manage critical information as simply and accurately as possible. Again, contributes to the efficiency and it contributes to the effectiveness of the rotation because it's easier for the preceptor to critically evaluate information that the student is managing, and it also guides the student as they're managing that information. The guaranteed preceptor techniques that we've covered in session 3, no phone zone, have a policy about how students are able to access their phones so they clearly understand when it's not appropriate to access their phones, and try to train them to check their phones in certain circumstances or at certain times during the day. And minutes matter, to make use of all the minutes. Be respectful of the time of the students, just as you expect them to be respectful of you. One thing I might add in relation to the time management of a rotation, sometimes the preceptor is going to be late to a meeting. I would expect my students to be on time. If we called a meeting for 8 o'clock and they show up at 8:05, I would let them know that that's not appropriate. I've got a lot of other things to do, and those wasted 5 minutes have just edged away at my responsibilities. Sometimes, however, because of the nature of the preceptor's responsibilities in a hospital, it might be necessary for them to be somewhat late. That's a golden opportunity to demonstrate a clear understanding of professional responsibilities. If you demand of your students to show up on time, and in a certain circumstance you are not able to show up on time, I would use that as a learning opportunity and clarify the priority to the students by letting them know how much I regret being late, and even going to the extent of apologizing to them for being late to a meeting that I called. This sends a clear message to the students how important that professional value is to the preceptor. And he's willing to humble himself and acknowledge that even preceptors should show up on time because time matters. Minutes matter. Our remaining 2 sessions, we're going to cover strategies for bringing out the best in every student. And we'll be talking in this one about how to interact with students in such a way that we help them succeed, but also how we address situations in which they're not performing up to our expectations, how we can make the corrective interventions based on the feedback that we provide. And then in our last session, we'll be talking about the characteristics and traits of great preceptors and great rotations. And in that last session, I'm not just going to be providing my own opinions, but I'm going to be providing information that's well documented in pharmacy literature.